The massive lecture hall on Centauri Prime buzzed with the sounds of 100 different species settling into their seats. Crystal beings from Zephyria clinked softly as they found spots that could support their weight. Gas-based creatures from the nebula systems floated in special containment suits near the ceiling. Multi-limbed students from Kortha clicked their claws on desks as they prepared their recording devices. In the back row, Zara Chen sat quietly with her simple paper notebook. She was one of only 3 humans in the entire Galactic University, and she felt that difference every single day. Her classmates needed special equipment to breathe, sit, or even see properly in what the university called standard conditions. Zara just needed a chair and some air. Professor Vexthak entered the room with his usual dramatic flair. The tall, green-skinned Hegemony Council member had 4 arms and eyes that could see in 12 different light spectrums. His reputation as the galaxy's leading expert on planetary classification preceded him everywhere he went. Students across the known worlds competed just to attend his lectures. "Welcome, students, to Advanced Planetary Classification," Professor Vexthak announced, his voice carrying easily through the hall's translation systems. "Today we will discuss the most important aspect of galactic exploration, identifying worlds that pose threats to civilized life." Zara leaned forward in her seat. This was why she had fought so hard to get into this class. For her entire life she had heard whispers about Earth, her ancestral homeworld. The few humans scattered across the galaxy all came from rescue missions that had evacuated small groups centuries ago. But no one would tell her why Earth needed to be abandoned. The professor activated his holographic display, showing a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy. Red dots marked dangerous zones, yellow showed caution areas, and green indicated safe worlds suitable for colonization. "Class, observe the color coding system," Vexthak continued, pointing with 2 of his arms while the other 2 operated controls. "Red zones contain worlds so hostile that no known species can survive there. These include planets with surface temperatures exceeding 60 degrees Celsius, gravitational forces above 1.2 standard units, or atmospheric compositions containing more than 18% reactive gases." A student from the methane-breathing Titan colonies raised a tentacle. "Professor, what about worlds with liquid water covering more than 50% of the surface? Are those not considered hazardous?" "Excellent question," Vexthak replied. "Worlds with excessive water coverage fall into our yellow caution category. The constant weather changes, storm systems, and flood risks make long-term habitation extremely dangerous." Zara felt her heart sink. Earth had vast oceans and weather patterns. It also had higher gravity than most worlds she had visited, and she knew the oxygen levels were around 21%. By galactic standards, her homeworld was basically a death trap. The professor moved to a new section of his display. "Now let us examine some specific examples of worlds marked for permanent quarantine." The display zoomed in on a small blue and green planet on the edge of the galaxy. This world, designated as Sol 3 but sometimes called Earth in historical records, represents a perfect example of classification protocols in action. Zara's breath caught in her throat. There it was, her ancestral home, floating in the holographic display like a beautiful marble. Sol 3 received a Quarantine Class 7 designation after our initial survey mission, Vexthak explained. The automated probe sent to investigate lasted mere hours before being destroyed by the planet's hostile environment. The official report documented atmospheric toxins, gravitational anomalies, and aggressive macrofauna that eliminated our equipment within standard planetary day cycles. A crystalline student near the front shimmered, which Zara had learned meant they were confused. "Professor, if the world was so dangerous, how did any life forms survive there at all?" "An excellent observation," Vexthak said, clearly pleased with himself. "This is why Sol 3 serves as such an important teaching example. The life forms that evolved there represent evolution's most extreme adaptation to hostile conditions. These creatures, including the dominant species that called themselves humans, developed such specialized survival traits that they could only exist in that specific environment." Zara felt heat rising in her chest. She looked around the room at her classmates, all struggling with the comfortable conditions of the lecture hall. She was sitting there in a simple shirt and pants, breathing normally, completely relaxed in conditions that required life support systems for everyone else. The human specimens we encountered were fascinating from a biological standpoint, the professor continued. They had developed internal temperature regulation systems, enhanced bone density to survive crushing gravity, and respiratory systems that could process highly reactive atmospheric compositions. Of course, these extreme adaptations made them completely unable to survive in normal galactic environments without extensive technological support. That was completely wrong. Zara had lived on 6 different worlds since leaving the human refugee station where she grew up. She had never needed any special equipment beyond what was required for space travel itself. In fact, most worlds felt easier to live on than the stories she heard about Earth. The Council made the humanitarian decision to evacuate small populations of humans to properly controlled environments before the planet could claim more lives, Vexthak said. Those survivors and their descendants now live safely in our protection across various worlds, though they require constant monitoring and support. Zara's hand shot up before she could stop herself. The entire lecture hall turned to look at her, hundreds of alien eyes focusing on the lone human in the back row. "Yes, Miss Chen?" Professor Vexthak said, and she could hear the slight annoyance in his voice. He clearly did not appreciate being interrupted. "Professor, I was wondering about the actual survey data from Earth," Zara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "How long did the survey team spend on the planet before making their classification decision?" "The survey was conducted by our most advanced automated probe systems," Vexthak replied dismissively. "The data collected was more than sufficient for proper classification. But how long were the probes actually on the surface?" Zara pressed. The professor's skin changed to a slightly darker shade of green, which meant he was getting irritated. "Miss Chen, perhaps you should focus on understanding our established classification protocols rather than questioning survey methodologies that were implemented centuries before your time." Several students made sounds that Zara recognized as alien laughter. She felt her face burn with embarrassment, but she was not ready to give up. "Just think it's important to understand how decisions get made about entire worlds and species," she said quietly. "The decisions were made by experts far more qualified than anyone in this room," Professor Vexthak said firmly. "The classification of Sol 3 has stood for over 300 years because it was based on sound scientific principles and direct observational evidence." He turned back to his display, clearly considering the discussion closed. "Now let us move on to examine Class 8 quarantine worlds which present even greater hazards to civilized exploration." Zara sank back into her seat, but her mind was racing. Something about the professor's explanation did not make sense. If Earth was so dangerous that advanced probes could not survive there, how had humans not only survived but built entire civilizations? And if humans were so perfectly adapted to impossible conditions, why could she live comfortably almost anywhere? As the lecture continued around her, Zara made a decision. She was going to find out what really happened during that survey mission. She was going to learn the truth about Earth, even if she had to do it on her own. The professor might have dismissed her questions, but Zara Chen was just getting started. 3 weeks passed before Zara got her chance. Her work-study job in the university archives was supposed to be simple filing and data organization, but it also gave her access to historical records that most students never saw. She had been patient, waiting for the right moment when the head archivist would be away long enough for her to do some investigating. The restricted section hummed with the quiet energy of thousands of data storage units. Information from across the galaxy was kept here, including original survey reports that were too sensitive for general academic access. Zara's hands shook slightly as she entered her access codes. Technically, she was authorized to be here, but what she was planning to look for was definitely not part of her assigned duties. She found the Sol 3 files faster than expected. For a planet that was supposedly too dangerous to approach, there seemed to be surprisingly few documents about it. The main file contained exactly what Professor Vexthak had described: automated probe data, classification decisions, and evacuation records for human populations. But as Zara read through the actual survey reports, her confusion grew into something much stronger. The first probe had landed on Earth during what the report called a severe weather event. Reading the technical specifications, Zara realized the probe had been destroyed by rain. Not acid rain or some exotic atmospheric phenomenon, just regular water falling from clouds. The probe sensors had registered the water as corrosive atmospheric discharge, because its designers had never encountered liquid water precipitation before. The second probe had been deployed in what the survey team classified as extreme gravitational conditions. The technical readout showed gravitational force at 10 standard units. Zara blinked at the screen several times, certain she was reading it wrong. 1 standard unit was normal gravity, the baseline that all other measurements were compared to. Every world she had ever lived on had gravity between 0.7 and 1.2 standard units, and she had never noticed any difference. The third probe landed in an area with aggressive macrofauna. The visual records showed the probe being approached by what appeared to be a large, brown creature with 4 legs. The creature sniffed the probe, appeared to lose interest, and wandered away. The probe's danger assessment systems had classified this as hostile investigation by unknown predator and automatically triggered the self-destruct sequence. Zara stared at the image of the creature on her screen. It looked almost exactly like the friendly animals she had seen in petting zoos on the agricultural worlds where humans had been settled. She was pretty sure she was looking at a cow. As she continued reading, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every danger the probes had encountered was something that humans lived with every day. The atmospheric toxins were oxygen levels that humans needed to breathe. The gravitational anomalies were normal Earth gravity. The aggressive macrofauna were probably just curious animals doing what animals do. But the most shocking discovery came when she found the evacuation records. The humans who had been rescued from Earth had not been evacuated from a dying planet. They had been taken from thriving cities, family homes, and peaceful communities. The evacuation teams had arrived expecting to find survivors clinging to life in a hostile wasteland. Instead, they found a planet full of people who were doing just fine. The reports described the confusion of the evacuation teams when they found humans living comfortably in conditions that required full environmental suits for the rescuers. There were notes about humans refusing to leave their homes because they could not understand what danger they were supposed to be escaping from. Zara felt sick as she read testimony from evacuation team members who described having to convince humans that their planet was doomed. The teams had used translations of the scientific reports about atmospheric toxins and environmental hazards to persuade people that they needed to be saved from their own world. She opened her personal communicator and began reaching out to other humans scattered across the galaxy. There were not many of them, maybe a few thousand total, but most stayed in contact through informal networks. Marcus Webb responded first from his agricultural station on Kepler 442b. Zara, good to hear from you. What's this about Earth survey data? Marcus, what do you know about the original evacuation? Zara asked. Did your family ever talk about why they left Earth? There was a long pause. My grandmother used to say they told her the air was poison and the gravity would crush her children. But she always laughed when she said it. She used to joke that the rescue teams needed machines to breathe our air and could barely walk in our gravity. Sarah, Kim called from her research post on Wolf 35P9C. My great-grandfather left some recordings, she said. He talked about how the aliens who came to save them kept falling down because they couldn't handle normal gravity. He said it was like being rescued by people made of glass. David Rodriguez joined the conversation from his engineering job on Proxima Centauri b. The stories in my family were always weird, he said. They talked about how the evacuation ships had to create special chambers just so humans could survive the trip. But the conditions in those chambers were harsher than what they left behind on Earth. As more humans joined the conversation, the same patterns emerged from every family history. The rescue teams had struggled with Earth's environment while humans lived there comfortably. The evacuation ships required environmental controls to keep humans alive during space travel. But those controlled environments were actually more difficult for humans than Earth had been. There's something else, said Elena Vasquez from her teaching position on Gliese 667cc. Has anyone else noticed how easy it is for us to adapt to new worlds? I've lived on 4 different planets, and I've never needed any special equipment beyond basic life support for space travel. Same here, Marcus replied. I work in agricultural zones that other species consider extreme environments. The Zephyrians need cooling suits just to visit my greenhouse. Zara felt pieces clicking together in her mind. What if we've been looking at this backwards? She said slowly. What if Earth wasn't classified as dangerous because it was hostile to life? What if it was classified as dangerous because it created life forms that were too adapted to harsh conditions? The communication channel fell silent as everyone processed what she was suggesting. "You mean," Sarah said carefully, "that they were afraid of us, not afraid for us?" "Think about it," Zara continued, her excitement growing. "Every world I've been to, humans work in the jobs that other species consider hazardous. We live in climate zones that require environmental suits for everyone else. We eat foods that would poison most galactic species." David laughed, but it was not a happy sound. "So instead of recognizing that humans might be useful allies, they decided we were too dangerous to leave on our home planet. Or," Elena added grimly, "they decided our planet was too dangerous to let anyone else discover what kind of beings it could produce." Zara looked back at the survey reports on her screen. Now they read like documents written by people who had encountered something they could not understand and decided it was safer to classify it as impossible rather than acknowledge their own limitations. "I'm going to keep digging," she told the others. "There has to be more information somewhere." "Be careful," Marcus warned. "If you're right about this, then a lot of very important people have been wrong for a very long time. They might not appreciate having that pointed out." After ending the call, Zara sat alone in the quiet archive room, staring at the evidence scattered across her screen. The truth was becoming clear, and it was much bigger than just a classification error. For centuries, humanity had been treated as refugees from a hostile world when they should have been recognized as the most adaptable species the galaxy had ever encountered. She began copying files to her personal storage device. Professor Vexthak might have dismissed her questions in class, but she was going to make sure he could not dismiss the facts. Zara's research expanded far beyond the Earth survey files. She began pulling data on human performance across the galaxy, looking for patterns that the academic establishment might have missed. What she found was even more shocking than the cover-up about Earth. Humans were not just surviving in the galaxy, they were thriving in places where no one else could work. The mining operations on Titan's Edge employed mostly humans because they were the only species that could handle the extreme, cold and low gravity without bulky environmental suits. The agricultural stations in the Outer Rim used human workers because they could adapt to the irregular day-night cycles that drove other species to madness. Deep space construction crews were primarily human because they recovered faster from the physical stress of zero-gravity work. What the galaxy saw as humans being given the dangerous jobs, Zara realized, was actually humans being the only ones capable of doing those jobs safely. She pulled up employment statistics from across known space. Humans made up less than 0.001% of the galactic population, but they represented over 15% of workers in environments classified as hazardous duty. The survival rates for humans in these environments were not just good. They were better than the survival rates for other species in normal working conditions. The medical data was even more revealing. Human healing rates were significantly faster than galactic averages. Human immune systems adapted to new pathogens with a speed that alien doctors found difficult to believe. Human physical endurance in challenging conditions exceeded what most species could achieve with technological assistance. Dr. Kethvar, the hegemony's leading expert on interspecies biology, had written extensively about the human anomaly. His papers described human physiology as impossible under normal evolutionary conditions and suggested that humans must have evolved under extreme selective pressures that should have prevented the development of advanced intelligence. Zara laughed out loud when she read that Dr. Kethvar was describing evolution on Earth perfectly, but he was so convinced that Earth was uninhabitable that he could not connect the obvious dots. She started cross-referencing human settlement data with planetary hazard classifications. The pattern was so clear she wondered how no one had noticed it before. Human colonies consistently chose locations in amber zones, areas that other species considered marginally habitable. But humans did not just survive in these places. They built thriving communities that outperformed settlements in green zones where conditions were supposed to be ideal. The temperature ranges that humans found comfortable overlapped with what the Galactic Health Organization classified as extreme thermal stress conditions for most other species. The atmospheric compositions that humans could breathe without assistance were labeled as toxic environmental hazards in safety manuals. Even more interesting, Zara discovered that human settlements had significantly lower crime rates, higher productivity scores, and better mental health indicators than mixed-species colonies. It was as if humans actually performed better when they were facing challenges that other species found overwhelming. She decided to test her theory with a direct experiment. Using her university access, she requested assignment to a research project on Kepler 438b, a world that had been classified as marginally habitable and was used primarily for training exercises in extreme environment survival. The planet featured temperature swings from 40 to 60 degrees Celsius, atmospheric pressure 1.3 times galactic standard, and gravity at 1.12 standard units. The rotation period was 35.2 standard hours, creating day-night cycles that most species found disorienting. It was exactly the kind of world that humans seemed to love. Professor Vexthak approved her research proposal without really reading it. He probably assumed she was setting herself up for failure, which would prove his point about human limitations. Zara arrived on Kepler 438b with standard research equipment and basic environmental gear. The other researchers on the project, 2 Zephyrians, a nebulite, and a Corthan, were shocked that she had not brought the full environmental control systems that they considered essential for survival. Within her first week on the planet, Zara was outperforming the entire research team. While they struggled with the gravity and temperature changes, she was hiking across terrain that they could only explore with powered assistance suits. While they needed constant atmospheric monitoring and backup life support, she was working comfortably with basic protective equipment. The team leader, Dr. Crystalline Song of Winds, a Zephyrian whose name sounded like breaking glass, filed daily reports about the anomalous human performance they were observing. Zara was not just adapting to conditions that challenged the rest of the team. She was thriving in ways that seemed to violate established biological principles. By the end of her 3rd week, Zara was leading exploration missions into areas that the original survey teams had marked as too dangerous for extended research. She discovered 3 new species of plants that could potentially provide food sources for galactic agriculture. She mapped mineral deposits that could support mining operations. She identified optimal locations for permanent research stations. All of this in conditions that required the rest of her team to work in shifts to avoid exhaustion. Dr. Crystalline Song of Winds confronted her directly about her performance. Zara Chen, your capabilities do not match any known biological parameters for your species, the Zephyrian said, their crystalline body chiming with confusion. The medical databases indicate that humans require technological support for survival in environments like this. Maybe the medical databases are wrong, Zara replied. That is impossible. The data comes from centuries of observations and direct measurements. Zara pulled up her personal communicator and showed Dr. Crystalline Song of Winds the employment statistics she had compiled. Look at where humans actually work, she said. Look at what we actually do. Does this match what your medical databases say we should be capable of? The Zephyrians spent several hours reviewing the data, their body making sounds like wind chimes in a storm. This suggests systematic errors in our understanding of human biology, they finally admitted. Or, Zara said carefully, systematic errors in our understanding of what constitutes normal environmental conditions. Meanwhile, back at the university, Professor Vexthak was becoming aware of Zara's research activities. Other faculty members had begun asking questions about the human student, who was apparently conducting unauthorized investigations into classified survey data. Some were wondering why a first-year student was outperforming graduate-level researchers on hazardous world assignments. Professor Vexthak accessed Zara's academic files and discovered the pattern of her research requests. She had been systematically examining every piece of data related to human capabilities and planetary classifications. Worse, she was apparently building a case that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying galactic exploration protocols. He sent a message to the university administration expressing concerns about security risks related to a student who was exceeding appropriate boundaries in her research activities. He recommended that Zara Chen be transferred to a more controlled academic program where her activities could be properly supervised. But Professor Vexthak had made a critical error. His complaint had to be filed through official channels, which meant it became part of the university's public record system. Within hours, Zara received notification that her academic standing was under review. She realized that her research had attracted exactly the kind of attention she had been trying to avoid. But she also realized that meant she was close to something important enough to make powerful people nervous. When she returned from Kepler 438b, Zara made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to continue her research in secret, she was going to make it public. She was going to force the academic establishment to confront the truth about humanity's place in the galaxy. Professor Vexthak wanted to suppress her investigation, but Zara was about to turn it into the biggest academic controversy in galactic history. Zara submitted her formal request for an academic debate on the morning she returned from Kepler 438b. The university's debate system was designed to encourage scholarly discussion of controversial topics, and any student could challenge any professor to defend their published positions in a public forum. Professor Vexthak received the challenge notification with a mixture of anger and disbelief. A first-year student was formally disputing his classification of Earth and questioning the fundamental principles of planetary survey methodology. Under normal circumstances, he would have simply denied the request and had the student disciplined for academic impropriety. But Zara had been clever about how she framed her challenge. She had not accused him of being wrong. She had simply requested clarification of apparent inconsistencies between his published work and recent observational data. She had cited proper academic sources, followed all procedural requirements, and presented her request in language that made it difficult to refuse without appearing afraid of student scrutiny. More importantly, word of the challenge had already spread through the university's communication networks. Students across campus were talking about the human who was challenging the famous Professor Vexthak about Earth. Faculty members in other departments were curious about what evidence a first-year student thought she had discovered. Professor Vexthak realized that refusing the debate would create more problems than accepting it. A public refusal would suggest that he could not defend his own published research against questions from a student. But accepting meant giving Zara a platform to present whatever misguided theories she had developed during her unauthorized investigations. He decided that the safest approach was to accept the debate and use it as an opportunity to demonstrate why students should not attempt research beyond their academic level. A public defeat of Zara's arguments would serve as a valuable lesson for other students who might be tempted to question established scientific principles. The debate was scheduled for the university's grand auditorium, and interest grew far beyond what anyone had expected. Representatives from the Hegemony Council requested permission to attend. News networks across the galaxy picked up the story of a human student challenging galactic orthodoxy about her own species' homeworld. Dr. Crystalline Song of Winds arrived on Centauri, Prime 2 days before the debate, bringing detailed reports about Zara's performance on Kepler 438b. Other researchers who had worked with humans in extreme environments began sharing their own observations. A picture emerged of systematic discrepancies between official human capabilities assessments and actual human performance. Professor Vexthak spent his preparation time reviewing established academic sources and reinforcing the traditional arguments for Earth's quarantine classification. He was confident that centuries of scientific consensus would easily overwhelm whatever amateur research a student had managed to compile. Zara spent her preparation time differently. She reached out to every human in the galaxy who was willing to share their story. She compiled video testimonials from humans working in conditions that required environmental suits for other species. She gathered performance data from human settlements on worlds that were supposed to be too challenging for permanent habitation. Most importantly, she connected with humans who remembered the original evacuation from Earth. These were the oldest humans in the galaxy, and their families had preserved stories that had never been officially recorded. Elena Vasquez's great-grandmother had made audio recordings about the evacuation that Elena had never shared with anyone outside her family. In those recordings, the old woman described Earth as a beautiful world with clean air, comfortable weather, and abundant food. She talked about the confusion her family felt when aliens arrived to save them from dangers they could not see. Marcus. Webb's family had preserved video messages from relatives who had chosen to stay on Earth rather than join the evacuation. The videos showed green landscapes, blue skies, and people living normal, happy lives in the supposedly deadly environment that had been classified as uninhabitable. Sarah Kim brought the most shocking evidence of all. Her family had maintained contact with Earth through hidden communication channels for over a century. Earth was not a dead world. Humans were still living there, thriving in the conditions that galactic science claimed should have killed them all. The night before the debate, Zara could not sleep. She reviewed her notes one final time, knowing that she had only one chance to present evidence that could change humanity's status in the galaxy. If she failed, the truth about Earth and human capabilities would be buried for another few centuries. The grand auditorium filled beyond capacity on the morning of the debate. Students, faculty, government representatives, and news crews packed every available space. For the first time in university history, the debate was being broadcast live across the galaxy. Professor Vexthak entered the auditorium to respectful applause from the academic establishment. He wore his formal council robes and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never lost a public debate. Zara walked onto the stage wearing simple human clothing and carrying a single data pad. The contrast was intentional. She wanted to emphasize that she was not trying to impress anyone with authority or status. She was there to present facts. The debate moderator, Dean Flexera from the university's philosophy department, explained the format. Each participant would have 30 minutes for opening statements, followed by a question and response period, and concluding with final arguments. Professor Vexthak spoke first, presenting the traditional case for Earth's quarantine classification. He described the hostile environmental conditions, the failed survey missions, and the humanitarian evacuation of human populations to safer worlds. His presentation was polished, authoritative, and supported by centuries of academic consensus. When Zara's turn came, she began with a simple question. What if everything we think we know about Earth is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes normal environmental conditions? She presented the survey data that showed probes being destroyed by rain, normal gravity, and curious animals. She showed employment statistics that revealed humans consistently working in conditions that other species found hazardous. She played video testimonials from humans describing their comfortable lives on worlds that were officially classified as extremely challenging. But the moment that changed everything came when she connected to the hidden communication channels and broadcast live video from Earth itself. The audience watched in stunned silence as images filled the auditorium screens showing green forests, blue oceans, and clear skies. They saw human cities with millions of people living normal lives in the environment that galactic science had declared uninhabitable. Earth is not a dead world, Zara said quietly. Earth is a thriving world that produces beings capable of surviving almost anywhere. The question is not why Earth is too dangerous for humans. The question is why the galaxy has been so afraid of what Earth represents. Professor Vexthak stared at the screens showing living humans on a supposedly quarantined world. His carefully prepared arguments crumbled as he realized that the fundamental assumptions of his entire career were being challenged by direct observational evidence. In desperation, he made a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system, "if humans are truly as adaptable as you claim, then you should be willing to prove it. I challenge you to demonstrate these supposed capabilities under controlled conditions." The auditorium fell silent. Everyone understood what he was proposing. "There is a world called Krixna 7 that we use for training our most elite military units," Professor Vexithak continued. "It features environmental conditions so extreme that only our best soldiers can survive there with full technological support. If humans are truly the adaptable beings you claim, then you should be able to survive there with minimal equipment." Zara felt the weight of the galaxy's attention focused on her. She understood that Professor Vexthak was trying to call her bluff, expecting her to back down from an obviously impossible challenge, but she also understood that this was her chance to prove everything she had been arguing. "How long?" she asked. "1 week," Professor Vexthak replied. 7 standard days with the same basic survival equipment we provide to military trainees." Zara looked out at the thousands of beings watching her. knowing that her answer would determine humanity's future in the galaxy. "I accept," she said. The auditorium erupted in shocked sounds from 100 different species. Professor Vexthak had just challenged a student to risk her life to prove an academic point, and she had accepted. The debate had become something much more serious than an academic discussion. It had become a test that would be watched by every sentient being in known space. Krixna 7 was everything the military training reports had promised and worse. The shuttle that delivered Zara to the planet's surface could only land for 17 minutes before the changing atmospheric conditions made takeoff impossible. The pilot, a veteran of dozens of military transport missions, looked at her with what she was pretty sure was respect mixed with disbelief. "You have 7 days," he said through his environmental suit's communication system. "The extraction team will return to this exact location at 1400 hours next week. If you are not here, we will assume the worst." Zara shouldered her basic survival pack and stepped out onto the surface of the world that the galaxy used to test its toughest soldiers. The shuttle lifted off immediately, leaving her alone under a sky that shifted between deep purple and angry orange as 3 different suns moved through complex orbital patterns. The gravity was 1.4 standard units, enough to make every step feel like she was carrying extra weight. The air was thin and sharp with chemical smells that her nose did not recognize. The temperature was already dropping as the nearest sun moved behind the planet's irregular horizon, and she knew it would fall another 30 degrees before the night cycle ended. But Zara was not afraid. She was excited. For the first time in her life, she was in an environment that actually challenged her human capabilities. Every world she had lived on had felt slightly too easy, like everything was designed for beings more fragile than she was. Krixna 7 felt like a place where her evolutionary heritage might finally be useful. The broadcast equipment that would carry her survival attempt to audiences across the galaxy hummed quietly in her pack. Every moment of the next 7 days would be watched by billions of beings who had been told that humans needed protection from normal environmental conditions. Zara began walking away from the landing site, looking for shelter and water sources. The terrain was rocky and uneven, covered with plant life that looked more like crystalline sculptures than earth vegetation. Some of the formations pulsed with bioluminescent light, creating patterns that probably served as communication or warning systems. Within 2 hours, she had found a cave system that would provide protection from the temperature swings and weather patterns that made survival difficult for military teams. The caves showed signs of previous human habitation, scrape marks on walls, fire rings, and carved symbols that suggested other people had discovered this shelter during training exercises. But instead of just using the caves as a hiding place to wait out the week, Zara decided to explore. If she was going to prove that humans could thrive in conditions that challenged everyone else, she needed to do more than just survive. On her second day, she discovered that the crystalline plants were not just decorative. Many of them collected and stored water from the irregular precipitation that fell when atmospheric pressure changes created sudden storm systems. By carefully tapping into these natural reservoirs, she had access to clean water without needing to rely on her limited purification supplies. On her third day, she found that some of the native life forms were not only edible, but actually nutritious for human biology. The galaxy's military survival guides classified everything on Krixna 7 as potentially toxic, but Zara's human digestive system handled the alien proteins and minerals without any problems. By her fourth day, she was not just surviving but actively improving her situation. She had built tools from native materials, created a comfortable shelter system, and established reliable sources of food and water. The military training exercises usually focused on endurance challenges and equipment management, but Zara was turning Krixna 7 into a temporary home. The galaxy watched in growing amazement as the feeds from her survival attempts showed her moving through terrain that elite soldiers found difficult to navigate even with powered assistance. They saw her sleeping comfortably in temperature ranges that required thermal regulation suits for other species. They watched her eating native food sources and drinking local water without the extensive purification and testing protocols that were considered essential for survival. More importantly, they saw her enjoying herself. While military trainees typically spent survival exercises focused on enduring hardship until extraction, Zara was exploring, learning, and adapting with obvious enthusiasm. On her fifth day, she made a discovery that changed everything. While exploring a canyon system that military teams had marked as too dangerous for investigation, Zara found evidence of intelligent life, hidden in caves that could only be reached by climbing rock faces that most species would find impossible. She discovered artwork, tools, and shelter systems created by beings who were clearly not from any known galactic civilization. The inhabitants of Crixna 7 were still there, and they had been watching her. Contact came when Zara was sitting by her evening fire reviewing the day's explorations. 3 figures emerged from the shadows at the edge of her campsite, moving with the careful grace of people who were not sure whether they should be afraid or curious. They were humanoid but clearly not human, with longer limbs and skin that shifted color to match their surroundings. When they spoke, it was in a language that Zara did not recognize, but their body language suggested cautious interest rather than hostility. Zara stood slowly and raised her hands to show she was not carrying weapons. She gestured to her fire and the food she had been preparing, offering to share what she had. The beings approached carefully, and one of them spoke in heavily accented but understandable galactic standard. "You are not like the others who come here," the being said. "You move like you belong." Through careful conversation, Zara learned that Crixna 7 had an indigenous population that the galactic military had never encountered. These beings, who called themselves the Kretak, had been avoiding contact with galactic civilization because every exploration team that arrived on their world seemed to struggle with basic survival in conditions that the Kretak found comfortable. "The others who come here bring machines to breathe and walk and stay warm," one of the Kretak explained. "They move like they are afraid of everything, but you move like the world welcomes you." The Kretak had been hiding from galactic contact because they assumed that beings who needed so much technological support would not understand or respect a species that lived simply in harmony with their environment. They had classified galactic civilization as too fragile for meaningful interaction. Zara realized that she was looking at the mirror image of humanity's situation. Just as humans had been classified as too weak to survive outside of protected environments, the Kretak had classified galactic civilization as too weak to survive in natural environments. On her 6th day, Zara was no longer alone on Crixna 7. The Kretak had decided that she represented something new in their experience of galactic contact, and they were curious to learn more about the species that had produced someone who could thrive in conditions that challenged everyone else. The galaxy watched the live feeds in fascination as Zara established diplomatic contact with a previously unknown species, not through military conquest or technological superiority, but through simple adaptation and respect for local conditions. When the extraction shuttle arrived on the 7th day, they found Zara waiting at the designated coordinates with 3 Kretak representatives who had volunteered to make first contact with galactic civilization. She had not just survived a week on Crixna 7, she had established peaceful relations with its indigenous population and opened possibilities for cultural exchange that no one had imagined possible. The pilot who had dropped her off 7 days earlier stared at her through his environmental suit's visor. "How?" he asked simply. "I listened to what the planet was trying to teach me," Zara replied. "Instead of fighting it, I learned from it." As the shuttle lifted off from Crixna 7, carrying Zara and the Kretak representatives toward Centauri Prime, news of her success was already changing conversations across the galaxy. Military commanders were reviewing their training protocols. Exploration teams were reconsidering their approach to environmental challenges. Politicians were asking whether humanity's classification as a protected refugee population needed to be reevaluated. Professor Vexthak waited in the grand auditorium for Zara's return, knowing that his career and reputation were about to face their greatest challenge. He had tried to prove that humans were weak by sending Zara to face impossible conditions, but she had returned with evidence that humans might be the most adaptable species the galaxy had ever encountered. When Zara walked back onto the debate stage 7 days later, accompanied by 3 representatives of a species that had never made contact with galactic civilization, the auditorium fell silent. "Professor Vexthak," Zara said quietly, "you suggested that I should prove human capabilities under controlled conditions. I have returned with new friends who would like to discuss your classification protocols." The Kretak representative spoke in clear galactic standard, addressing the assembled academics and government officials. We have watched your people struggle on our world for generations. We believed you were too weak for meaningful contact, but this human has shown us that perhaps we simply encountered the wrong representatives of your civilization.